The flowers were fresh, white lilies, crystal vases, 3 arrangements, one by the window, one near the door, one positioned at a precise angle that only made sense if you imagined a camera crew. Someone had ordered them the same morning. Victor Carter was rushed to Hargrove Medical Center with a cardiac event that stopped his heart for 41 seconds in his own kitchen. By the time the flowers arrived, he was unconscious and breathing through a machine. By the time his family arrived, they were already busy. Selena, his wife of 11 years, had made 3 phone calls from the hospital parking garage before she went inside. None were to doctors. None were to family. She spent 8 minutes on the phone with someone whose name didn't appear in her contacts list, stored instead as a set of initials. And when she finally walked through the hospital doors, she had the particular stillness of a woman who had already started solving a problem, not grieving a person. Marcus, Victor's 26-year-old son, drove to the family estate in Westchester the same morning. He was gone 30 minutes. When he came back, he was carrying 2 leather portfolio folders that did not belong to him. He put them in his trunk and drove directly back to the hospital, where he sat in the family waiting room looking appropriately devastated. Victor's brother Dale canceled a 6-week business trip in less than 4 minutes. He didn't seem upset about it. He seemed, and the nurses who watched the family move through the corridor that first day would describe this carefully, choosing their words, organized, as if he'd made a list and was working through it. Nobody cried. Not once. Not with their whole body. The expressions on their faces were correct. The postures were appropriate. But something underneath all of it, something you could feel the way you feel a draft before you find the open window, was wrong. The man in the room behind them was not dead. He was 49 years old. His heart was beating with machine assistance. His brain was intact. His lungs were inflating and deflating with mechanical precision. And the people who called themselves his family were already treating his absence like a starting gun. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what Victor Carter was, not who. What? He was the kind of man who had engineered his wealth the way other men build walls, not for show, but to make sure nobody could get around him. Real estate holdings across 4 states, a private equity position in 2 logistics companies, a trust structure so airtight that his estate attorney once said, with genuine admiration and mild discomfort, that Victor hadn't built a financial plan. He'd built a maze that only he knew how to exit. Every major transfer required his signature. Every property sale, every distribution from the family trusts, every charitable gift, every business pivot, every account reallocation above a certain threshold, all of it was designed to run through him, and only him. Not because he was paranoid, though he had never been naive. Because Victor had grown up with exactly nothing, in a house with exactly nothing, and the only thing that had ever saved him was refusing to let anyone else hold the keys to anything that mattered. His family called this controlling. They called it that among themselves, carefully, in the corners of rooms Victor hadn't entered yet. They performed gratitude in his presence, the right watches, the right restaurants, the right references to the family name in professional settings, always with that particular emphasis on Carter, as if the name were an achievement they'd earned rather than one they'd simply inherited by proximity. In truth, they lived inside his financial architecture the way tenants live in a building, comfortable, dependent, and quietly suffocating under a landlord who never forgot a detail and never gave anything away twice. Selena had married him knowing exactly what he was. She was precise, composed, and almost preternaturally skilled at being whatever the room required. She had spent 11 years beside Victor with a performance so consistent it had become, in some ways, indistinguishable from a real marriage, except to anyone paying close attention to her eyes, which were always calculating something the conversation hadn't reached yet. Marcus had been handed a junior executive title at one of Victor's companies as a 25th birthday gift. What he hadn't been handed was any actual authority, a deliberate choice by Victor, who had looked at his son and seen something he recognized and didn't fully trust. Marcus spent the following year smiling through meetings where his opinions were noted and then set aside. He wasn't stupid. He understood exactly what his father was doing. and he had hated him for it in the specific, patient way that only a son can hate his father, quietly enough to pass as love. Nicole, 24, law-educated and constitutionally cautious, had inherited Victor's instinct for structure without his warmth. She didn't trust anyone in the family enough to fully align with them, which made her the most dangerous one in the room at any given moment. And Dale, Victor's younger brother, had spent 20 years occupying that narrow space between family member and outside counsel, present at every gathering, trusted with nothing that mattered, patient in a way that eventually stops looking like patience and starts looking like preparation. They all needed Victor, right up until the morning his heart stopped in his kitchen and a different set of calculations became possible. By day 2, the patterns were no longer subtle. Selena had made herself the family's single point of contact for all medical updates. Calls from Victor's oldest business associates, men who had known him for decades, men who had helped him build what he had, were routed to her assistant and answered with a polished statement about privacy and gratitude. At least 3 of those associates later said they'd called twice and never received a personal response. One of them sent a letter, handwritten, addressed to Victor's estate. The letter was signed for by Selena. Victor never saw it. Marcus had begun appearing at the operations offices of Victor's primary logistics company, not because anyone requested it, because he simply started showing up and using carefully vague language, continuity of leadership, stability during uncertainty, making sure nothing falls through, that positioned him as a natural authority without actually claiming one. Frank Osei, the operations director, sent an email to Victor's personal address asking if Marcus had been given any formal interim role. The email sat unread for 11 days. Nicole visited the estate on day 3. She spent 43 minutes in Victor's private office, a room she had historically shown no interest in during 5 years of family events, and emerged carrying a tote bag that Rosa, the housekeeper who had worked for Victor for 9 years, immediately clocked as heavier than when Nicole went in. When Rosa asked if she could help with anything, Nicole smiled pleasantly and said she was collecting a few sentimental things. Rosa had unpacked and repacked Victor Carter's home across 2 moves and 1 significant renovation. She knew what his sentimental things looked like. They were a framed photo of him with his first son, a specific leather journal, a watch he never wore. None of those things were in the category Nicole was rifling through. What Nicole was photographing in rapid succession on her phone were financial documents, portfolio summaries, trust schedules, the kind of material a lawyer would want preserved before it disappeared. She was protecting herself, not from grief, from whatever came next. And Dale. Dale had spoken to the property manager twice by day 3. He had also met at a coffee shop 3 miles from the hospital with a man the property manager would later describe as carrying a legal briefcase and asking very specific questions about a parcel of undeveloped land on the Connecticut property's northwestern border. Dale told the manager it was a routine inquiry. The manager thought about it later and realized he had never been told who authorized Dale to make routine inquiries about anything at all. They gathered in the waiting room twice a day, sat for 30 minutes, spoke in lowered voices about logistics, embraced with their arms rather than their bodies, and said, "He's a fighter," with careful sincerity while checking their phones with the other hand. Watching them from a distance, watching them assemble, confer, and disperse, you would have thought you were watching a company run a crisis communications drill. You would have been more right than wrong. On the 4th evening, Selena hosted a quiet dinner at the estate. Just family, the text message said. No other explanation. No one asked for one. The table was set the way it always was. Dark wood, heavy silver, everything in its correct position. Victor's Scotch whiskey sat in its crystal decanter on the sideboard, untouched. Victor had a specific way of pouring it. 2 fingers, neat, facing the window. The decanter sat exactly as he'd left it, and something about that untouched glass, the Scotch still at his level, not anyone else's, felt like looking at a man who'd been erased but hadn't been told yet. Marcus sat in the chair to the left of Victor's seat. Not Victor's seat, but close enough that by the end of the evening he had shifted twice and was resting his arm on the head of the chair like it was his. They ate. They made careful, efficient conversation. And then, between the second wine pour and dessert, The language in the room shifted so smoothly, it was almost elegant. Marcus referred to the Colorado property as technically underperforming and suggested this might be a natural window for restructuring. Dale nodded with the calm of someone who had been thinking exactly this for several days already. Nicole mentioned, in the tone of someone reporting a minor administrative detail, that she had researched the trust documentation's incapacity provisions with a colleague at a corporate law firm. Incapacity provisions. She said it the way people say something when they've rehearsed it until it stops sounding like what it is. When Marcus asked Selena directly how long before the holding company's board would require a formal leadership decision, Selena didn't look up from her plate. She finished chewing, she refilled her glass, she set the bottle down with no particular emotion. "Give it another week," she said. "Don't force anything before we know which direction this goes." Which direction? No one asked her to clarify. No one needed to. She started taking her calls in the garage. Rosa noticed on day 5. The attached garage on the estate's north wing was Victor's space. His cars, his tools, a workbench he had never once used, the general organized emptiness of a room a very specific man had claimed and maintained. Selena had no reason to be in there, but starting that 5th day, she would disappear in that direction 2-3 times daily, staying for 10 to 15 minutes, and return each time with her face arranged into a composure that looked freshly applied. Her phone showed no call history during those windows. For a woman who ordinarily left her device face up on the kitchen counter and never cleared anything, this was not an accident. It was a system. At the hospital, the performance was excellent. She sat beside Victor every afternoon. She touched his hand. She learned every nurse's name and used them correctly the next visit. She asked the right questions of the right doctors in the right tone of measured hope. She dressed carefully, not hospital casual, but not overdressed either. Always the precise calibration of a woman managing her optics with the attention of a professional. But something in her body was wrong. Not grief, not fear. Something closer to the sustained, exhausting effort of maintaining a cover story in real time. The effort of a person who is privately managing something complex and has become, through practice, very skilled at making it look like nothing. A night shift nurse named Patricia heard a fragment of conversation outside Victor's room on the 7th day. She was passing in the corridor. The door was not fully closed. She heard a woman's voice, controlled, low, unhurried, say, "He doesn't know anything. Stop worrying about that." Selena came around the corner 10 seconds later, phone already in her pocket, expression completely neutral. Patricia returned to her station and said nothing, because it genuinely was not her business. But she thought about it afterward. She thought about the specific confidence in those words, not a frightened wife reassuring a friend, a woman managing a situation, issuing an instruction. 2 days later, Rosa was returning from an errand when she noticed a car parked on the residential street outside the estate's south gate. Silver, recent model, no commercial markings. It had been there when she left an hour and a half earlier. The driver was a man in his mid-40s, trim, well-dressed, silver at the temples, sitting completely still, watching the house with the specific quality of someone who was trying not to be noticed, but had not quite achieved it. Rosa memorized the face. She said nothing. She would remember it later. His name was Carter Reed. Not Carter as in the family name. That particular irony was unintentional, though it said something about the universe's sense of humor. Carter Reed was 51, silver-haired, trim, unhurried in the way that very confident men are unhurried. He wore suits that cost more than most people spent on furniture, and never once seemed to be trying. He had been Victor Carter's private financial advisor for 8 years. 8 years. He knew the trust architecture the way its designer knows the load-bearing walls. He knew which accounts had transfer restrictions and which were insulated from trustee oversight. He knew the inheritance waterfall, Who received what, in what sequence, under what conditions, better than Victor's own attorney. He knew where the soft points were, where money could be quietly redirected during a period of incapacity-driven confusion, when oversight was fragmented and no one was quite certain who held functional authority over what. He and Selina had been sleeping together for 14 months. They had been planning together for at least 9. Let that land for a moment. The man Victor Carter trusted with the complete architecture of his financial life, the man who sat across from Victor in quarterly meetings, who reassured him that every protection was in place, who Victor introduced at industry dinners as the reason I can sleep at night. That man had been in Selina's bed and in Selina's confidence for over a year, while Victor was sleeping. The affair hadn't started as strategy, but it had become one. Carter Reed wasn't just a lover, he was a key. Selina understood this early, and she acted on it deliberately. And Carter Reed, who had looked at Victor Carter's empire from the inside for 8 years and understood exactly how much of it was accessible if the right person were removed, understood that Selina wasn't a distraction. She was a position. Together they had sketched out what Victor's incapacity would open. Which accounts could be reallocated into structures Carter had quietly repositioned months in advance. How much could be moved during the window of confusion before trustees and attorneys got organized? They had not engineered Victor's collapse, but they had run the scenario. They had walked through it. They had a sequence. When Victor's heart stopped in his kitchen and the ambulance arrived, Carter Reed received a message from Selina's secondary number within 2 hours. It said, "It started. Stay ready." He was ready. The first transfer, a reallocation of a secondary investment account into a holding entity Carter had repositioned 6 months prior, went through 3 days later. Small, designed to be invisible, structured to avoid the alert thresholds Victor's attorney monitored. The second movement was scheduled for day 11. Victor was still unconscious. Carter Reed attended the following day's hospital family gathering briefly, expressed condolences with quiet sincerity, shook Marcus's hand, and left. Nobody found this strange. He was, after all, the family's trusted advisor. Marcus knew about the affair, not the financial layer underneath it, but he had been in the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton downtown 3 months earlier, on his way to a lunch meeting, when he spotted his mother and Carter Reed seated at the hotel bar, in a conversation that was not professional. He'd seen the specific way they repositioned when they noticed him. He'd understood immediately. He said nothing. He ran the calculus in the elevator on the way up and had reached his conclusion by the time he sat down for lunch. If Selina was aligned with Carter Reed, the man who controlled the financial architecture, then the affair was more valuable as silence than as confrontation. His mother positioned correctly meant Marcus's role would expand after. The secret was leverage. He filed it and used it as such. He had looked his mother in the eye at dinner that week and said nothing. She had looked back and known he knew and said nothing either. The understanding between them was transactional and immediate and required no words, which was perhaps the most disturbing part. Nicole was operating on instinct. She hadn't confirmed anything specific, but she had the lawyer's sensitivity to exposure. That particular, finely tuned sense that something in the structure is about to break, and that the smart move is to not be directly adjacent to the fracture point. She had quietly moved assets from a joint account she shared with Marcus into a personal corporate structure she controlled alone. She was protecting herself from whatever shape the disaster took, without needing to know its exact dimensions. Dale knew more than he ever indicated. Dale had known for years, because Dale paid attention to everything and processed it quietly and never let you see what he was retaining, that Victor had a son from his first marriage. A young man named Eli, now 30, who had been systematically minimized. First by the divorce, then by Selina, who had spent 11 years ensuring that Eli appeared in as few documents, as few gatherings, as few significant conversations as possible. Selina had talked Victor out of including Eli in estate planning discussions 4 separate times. She had described him, at various moments, as settled in his own life, not particularly interested, better off not burdened. Victor had listened. Victor had accommodated her, perhaps because it was easier, perhaps because his second marriage had become the thing he protected most. Dale had watched all of this happen. He had said nothing. He had been at every gathering where Eli's absence was quietly enforced. He had assisted when it was useful and waited when it wasn't. He was waiting now, too. The ugliest thing about a family like this isn't that one person is rotten. It's that the rot distributes. Each of them had touched it, rationalized it, and found the version of events where their particular piece of the betrayal was necessary or understandable or simply unavoidable. Marcus's silence was strategy. Nicole's document theft was protection. Dale's maneuvering was positioning. Selena's affair was what? A transaction that happened to include intimacy? They had dressed it in different fabric, but they were wearing the same thing. Dr. Anand made a notation in Victor's chart on day 6. Patient demonstrating intermittent response indicators, non-volitional, requires further assessment. What this meant in plain English? Something behind Victor's stillness was not absent. Something was registering. His cardiac rhythm shifted when specific voices entered the room. Not dramatically, not in ways that would read as consciousness to a casual observer, but measurably, consistently, and in patterns that correlated with particular speakers. When Marcus visited on day 7 and spent 20 minutes in the corner of the room on a phone call, speaking quietly about the Denver asset and whether it should be listed before or after the board meets, Victor's heart rate elevated 8 beats above baseline and held there for 11 minutes after Marcus walked out. When Nicole arrived on day 8, carrying her tote bag and briefly opened it near the foot of the bed to check something on her phone, Marcus's phone call playing quietly through one earpiece, the monitor showed a sustained variance that Dr. Anand flagged in her notes as atypically consistent for an unconscious patient in this stage. The most disturbing incident happened on day 9. Selena came alone. She performed the ritual, sat beside him, held his hand, spoke softly to the nurses. Then, believing herself unobserved, she leaned close to Victor's ear. The corridor camera had a partial angle into the room's corner. It recorded what came next. She said, quietly and without particular emotion, "I need you to understand that whatever happens, I've already made sure things will be fine. For everyone." She paused. Then, "Don't fight so hard, Victor. It's exhausting everyone." She kissed his forehead. She stood. She smoothed the front of her coat. She checked her reflection in the dark screen of her phone and walked out. The monitor showed a cardiac spike of 17 beats in under 40 seconds. It took 4 minutes and 12 seconds to return to baseline. Dr. Anand reviewed the data the next morning and wrote a single word in the margin of her notes. She crossed it out a minute later, but it was legible. Listening. By day 11, the pretense had thinned to almost nothing. Carter Reed attended 2 quiet meetings with estate planning professionals. Not officially, not on the record. He framed them as informational consultations on behalf of the family during a period of incapacity. Technically permissible, practically the financial equivalent of someone rifling through your wallet while you sleep. The estate planners asked, carefully, whether he had documented authority to inquire. Carter produced a letter of introduction from Selena. Selena had written it on the estate's formal letterhead. Marcus had refined his memo to the board, proposing himself as interim executive authority to its 4th draft. He hadn't sent it yet. He was calibrating the language. But he read through it every morning, adjusting a word here, a phrase there, the way you revise a document you are absolutely going to use. On day 12, a hospital social worker named Joel was passing the family consultation room when he heard voices through a door that had not been pulled completely shut. He was not eavesdropping. He simply heard what the room offered. The 3 voices were Selena, Marcus, and Dale. They were discussing cognitive outcomes. Specifically, the difference between Victor waking up fully alert versus waking with diminished capacity, and what each scenario legally required of the family in terms of authority and oversight. Marcus said, in a tone Joel later described as disturbingly businesslike, "If he comes back foggy, we have a lot more room to work with." Dale's response was quiet, and Joel couldn't reconstruct it. Selena said, "Let's not assume anything yet. Not, let's pray for the best. Not, he's going to be okay. Not even, we shouldn't be talking about this. Let's not assume anything yet." Joel returned to his office and sat for a long time. Then he wrote everything down and dated it. He was not wrong to do so. There was one more thing Joel did not hear. 2 days earlier, Dale had a private phone conversation, this one completely unwitnessed, reconstructed later only from phone records, with a contact he described in his notes as a regulatory timing specialist. The question Dale had posed, apparently, was how long a principal could remain in a documented incapacity before a trust's successor provisions could be formally invoked without legal challenge. The answer, apparently, was 14 days. Victor woke up on day 14. He did not gasp, he did not surge upward, he did not perform his return in any theatrical way. His eyes opened. The way someone's eyes open when they have been aware of the room for longer than anyone suspected and are now allowing it to be known. The nurse pressed the call button. Dr. Anand arrived in 4 minutes. Victor tracked movement, responded to instruction, squeezed on command, followed the light. The cognitive assessment took 2 days and showed no material impairment. He was, in every clinical measure, completely intact. But Victor Carter did not behave like a man who had returned from somewhere. He behaved like a man who had been listening in a dark room and was now simply turning on the lights. When Selena visited on day 3 of his consciousness, she came in with the expression she had been maintaining for 2 weeks. Composed concern, measured relief, a performance of a woman who had been holding it together stoically. She told him everyone had been praying, that the family was relieved and overjoyed, that the house was fine, that Rosa was fine, that everything had been managed carefully. Victor watched her the way you watch a weather system you've seen before and already know how to read. "I know," he said. That was all. Selena smiled. She squeezed his hand. She told him he needed rest. She did not sleep well that night. She didn't fully understand why. She told herself it was the residual stress. She told herself it was the adjustment. She told herself the worst was behind them. She had misread the situation completely. 2 weeks after his discharge, Victor's personal assistant delivered handwritten notes to each member of the family. He was requesting their presence at the estate on Saturday evening. Dinner, a family gathering, a time to reset, the note said. Marcus read his twice and concluded Victor wanted to appear magnanimous, the patriarch reclaiming the table with a gesture of reconciliation that would allow everyone to move forward. He rehearsed a version of remorse in his bathroom mirror. Not real remorse, the architectural kind, the kind you build to redirect attention rather than express it. Nicole called her attorney first. She decided that if she struck the correct balance of visible relief and quiet gratitude, her exposure was manageable. She had the documents. She had the personal corporate structure. She had deniability on several of the most significant items. She would be fine. Dale brought an expensive bottle of Bordeaux. He had decided that Victor, having been frightened by mortality, having almost lost everything, would arrive at this dinner in a mood for reconciliation rather than destruction. Powerful men, in Dale's experience, generally preferred maintaining their dynasty to burning it. He was calculating that Victor would be looking for a path forward, not a reckoning. Selena dressed in the color Victor had always told her was his favorite on her. She had spent the 2 weeks since his discharge recalibrating the Carter-Reed situation. The second transfer had been quietly reversed, the correspondence pruned from her secondary account, the meetings restructured into something that could be explained if necessary. She believed she had been thorough. She believed that whatever Victor had heard from a hospital bed, if anything, was fragmentary, ambiguous, deniable. She believed that the marriage, like the estate, could be preserved through management. They arrived at the table believing they could still perform their way out of whatever this was. They arrived like actors who hadn't been told the entire script had been rewritten. The house was warm. Rosa had cooked. The table was set exactly as it always was on formal evenings. Victor sat at the head, unhurried, eating with the careful attention of a man who is being polite because he has chosen to be polite, not because he is comfortable. He made minimal conversation through the first course. He asked Marcus about a logistics matter that Marcus answered too carefully. He asked Nicole about her work in a way that made her answer too briefly. He asked Dale about the Connecticut property in a way that made Dale's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Nobody relaxed. Nobody could identify why. The food was good, and the room was warm, and their host was courteous, and something in it felt exactly like the 5 seconds before an accident. Midway through the second course, Victor excused himself. He returned carrying a small remote control. He sat. He pressed a button. The flat screen on the dining room wall, decorative, never used, came on. The first image was a text message thread, names redacted. But the language in the messages was immediately legible to one person in the room, and that person's face changed before she could stop it. The messages discussed timing, account positions, continuing to handle things quietly, the window before the trustees activate oversight. Marcus looked at the screen, then at Selena, then back at the screen, and something in his expression clarified into the specific horror of a man who has been correctly included in a catastrophe he thought he'd kept his distance from. Victor pressed the button again. Bank records, transfer dates, amounts, destination entities, the secondary account reallocation, 3 movements, time-stamped, documented by the same estate attorney whose alerts Carter Reed had been careful to design around, and who had nevertheless been careful enough to preserve a parallel record for his own protection. Nicole's hand on the table stopped moving. Victor pressed the button again. Corridor footage from Hargrove Medical Center, day 9. The timestamp was visible. The angle showed Selena's back, the door, the posture of a woman leaning toward a patient's ear. The audio was clear. "Don't fight so hard, Victor. It's exhausting everyone." Marcus pushed his chair back from the table. Not dramatically, a reflex, the instinct of a person separating from a contamination source. He pushed it back from his own mother. Selena looked at the table. Her face had gone past the range of expressions she'd prepared. Victor pressed the button again. A document, a draft trust instrument with handwriting in the margins. Nicole's handwriting, her annotation style, the shorthand she used in legal work that she would have recognized from across the room. An alternative inheritance structure, unexecuted, prepared by Carter Reed, annotated by Nicole, designed to redirect Victor's estate in the event of his death. Nicole's face went rigid in the specific way of someone calculating whether silence is still a viable strategy. Dale stared at the screen with the expression of a man watching a door he had left unlocked come open from the wrong direction. Then Victor pressed the button one final time. One message, a single slide. Selena's number as sender, Carter Reed's number as recipient. Day 11 of the coma, 11:43 in the evening, 12 words on the screen. If he doesn't die on his own, this gets much more complicated. The room was so quiet you could hear the candles. Selena did not look up. She looked at the table, at her hands, at the arrangement of silverware she had chosen that morning with the particular care of a woman who still believed detail management was available to her. She did not look up once. Victor turned off the screen. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He picked up his water glass, considered it, set it down without drinking. "I heard things in that room," he said. "Not everything. Enough." He looked at Marcus first. Steady, clinical. "You knew about the affair. You chose silence because it served you." He looked at Nicole. "You photographed my files and had a lawyer draft a replacement trust with the man sleeping with my wife." He looked at Dale. "You ran timelines. You spoke to a regulatory consultant about incapacity provisions. You were building a clock around my unconscious body." Dale started to say something. "Don't," Victor said, and Dale stopped. He looked at Selena last. He looked at her for a long moment and then looked away, as if she had already ceased to be present in a meaningful sense. "The prenuptial agreement is precise," he said. "You receive exactly what it specifies and nothing beyond it. The attorneys have already been briefed. Carter Reed's professional relationship with this family is terminated, and the documentation from the transfers has been forwarded to the relevant regulatory board." Selena looked up. "Victor, the trusts have been restructured," he said, "under a new legal team in a new jurisdiction with new protections. None of you, not Marcus, not Nicole, not Dale, will receive a distribution from my estate." The room processed this in silence. Then Marcus's composure cracked into something between rage and pleading, and he began a sentence that Victor cut off with a single raised hand. "And everything," Victor said, "goes to Eli." The name hit the room like a physical object. Eli, the son from the first marriage. The young man Selena had spent 11 years making invisible, had talked Victor out of including in estate meetings, had described at gatherings as settled and disinterested, had systematically minimized in every legal document, every significant conversation, every moment when Victor's priorities were being quietly shaped. The one member of Victor's family who had never asked for anything, never positioned himself, never showed up at the estate to carry out leather folders. "You spent years convincing me he didn't belong here," Victor said to Selena. He said it without heat, without pleasure, the way you state a fact that has been verified beyond argument. "You were thorough. I noticed everything you did. I just, for a long time, chose not to." He buttoned his jacket. "The documentation transferring the estate to Eli is executed and sealed. His attorneys have already confirmed receipt." He pushed his chair back cleanly. "This dinner was the last occasion you will be received in this house. Rosa will see you out." He walked out of the room. He did not look back once. Not once. They found out later that Eli had met with Victor's legal team 3 days before that dinner. He had driven himself. He arrived 7 minutes early. He sat in the conference room with the calm of someone who had spent 30 years not expecting anything from his father's world and had consequently never constructed his sense of himself around it. When the attorney walked him through the full scope of the inheritance, the real estate holdings, the equity positions, the trust cascade, the property portfolio across 4 states, Eli listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, one about the timeline for formal transfer, and one about whether Victor's personal household staff would be retained. The attorney said yes. Eli thanked him and shook hands and left. He didn't celebrate. He didn't call anyone. He drove back the way he'd come, and that evening he sent his father a single text message. "Whenever you're ready, I'll be here." Victor read it that night in his office. The whiskey he hadn't touched in 3 weeks was finally poured. He sat with it in both hands and read the message and read it again. He didn't reply immediately. He sat in the particular silence of a man who had spent his entire life confusing control with trust and had, at great cost, finally understood the difference. He had built a fortress. He had sealed every entrance. He had designed every protection and engineered every lock. And then he had handed the keys to the people who had already been making copies. The only person who had never tried to take anything was the only one who had never been given anything. Victor Carter sat with his whiskey and looked at the dark window and thought about the years it had taken him to see clearly what had always been right in front of him. Then he typed back, "I'm ready now."